At dawn in Kyoto, the temple was already burning. Inside Honno-ji, Oda Nobunaga, the most powerful warlord in Japan, had woken to gunfire and smoke. He had come to the capital with only a small group around him. Outside, the troops of Akechi Mitsuhide, one of his own senior vassals, had closed around the temple. By the end of the morning, Nobunaga would be dead, his body lost or consumed in the fire, and the dream of one man ruling Japan would be thrown into chaos. Among the men trapped in that collapse was someone the records almost never know how to describe. A man from Africa, tall enough to be noticed by everyone who saw him, dark-skinned in a city where crowds had once crushed forward just to look at him. A man who had entered Japan with Jesuit missionaries, been brought before Nobunaga, and in less than a year had become visibly attached to the center of power. His name was Yasuke. What happened next is the part that turns his life from a curiosity into a mystery. After Nobunaga died, Yasuke did not simply vanish into the smoke. The surviving accounts place him with Nobunaga's son, Oda Nobunaga, at another fortified residence nearby. There, the second center of the Oda clan also collapsed. Nobunaga died. Yasuke was captured. And then, unlike the Japanese warriors around him, he was not killed. He was handed back to the Jesuits. The explanation attached to that mercy is ugly and revealing. The sources suggest that Akechi's side spared him not because they recognized him as an equal enemy, but because they treated him as foreign, outside the rules of Japanese warrior death, not fully part of the world he had just fought inside. That is the last confirmed moment. After that, nothing. No grave, no later battle, no confirmed return to Africa or Portuguese Asia. No record of an old man telling the story of the morning he survived the fall of Nobunaga. Just a name, a few fragments, and a silence that has lasted more than 400 years. Assassin's Creed Shadows gives Yasuke a full life on screen. It gives him choices, enemies, movement, and a voice. History gives him something much more difficult to hold. A year of sudden visibility, one night inside one of Japan's most famous betrayals, and then darkness. This is not the story of proving a legend. It is the story of following the fragments as far as they go and stopping where they stop. This is the true story behind Assassin's Creed Shadows, and it begins with a city trying to see the man it did not yet know how to name. The first thing Yasuke became in Japan was not a warrior. He became an event. He entered the written record in 1581, traveling with the Jesuit visitor Alessandro Valegnano, the official sent to inspect the Catholic missions across Asia. The exact place of Yasuke's birth is not known. Later writers have suggested East Africa, Mozambique, or another part of the Portuguese Indian Ocean world. The sources are not strong enough to close the question. What we can say safely is narrower. He was African. He had been moving through the networks of Portuguese Asia. By the time he appeared in central Japan, he was attached to Valegnano's party as an attendant or bodyguard. That word, attached, hides more than it reveals. The Portuguese Indian Ocean was a world of ports, missions, warships, merchants, enslaved people, interpreters, guards, converts, and hired men whose lives crossed languages by necessity. Yasuke may have entered that world by violence, by employment, by conversion, by service, or by some path the documents never bothered to preserve. We should not pretend to know. What matters is that before Japan ever saw him, he had already crossed a chain of seas and empires that connected Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Macau, and Nagasaki. That placed him at the crossing point of two unsettled worlds. Japan was in the late Sengoku period, an age of civil war, armed monasteries, rival clans, and shifting alliances. The Portuguese and Jesuits had opened new routes into Japan. bringing Christianity, trade, firearms, silk, medicine, rumors, and people from far beyond the islands. Yasuke arrived inside that stream of movement. He was not the only foreigner in Japan, but he was foreign in a way most Japanese observers had never seen. The accounts of his arrival in the capital are extraordinary because they are not quiet. In Sakai and Kyoto, people crowded to see him. Jesuit reports describe crowds pressing forward with such force that buildings were damaged and people were injured. The new church in Kyoto nearly became a casualty of curiosity. The city was not merely looking at Yasuke, it was surging toward him. This is the first important caution in his story. The record does not begin by telling us what Yasuke thought. It tells us how other people reacted to his appearance. His height, his skin, his strength, his difference. The sources preserve the gaze before they preserve the person. That gaze reached the ears of Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was not simply a local lord. By 1581, he was the central force in Japanese politics. He had defeated old enemies, built Azuchi Castle, and turned new technologies, court rank, commerce, religion, and spectacle into tools of rule. He was famous for using whatever worked. If something strengthened his power or magnified his image, he wanted to see it. So when the city erupted over an African man in the Jesuit party, Nobunaga demanded that the man be brought before him. The first meeting is often retold as the beginning of a friendship or the discovery of a heroic destiny. The safer reading is colder and more interesting. A ruler preoccupied with power summoned a man who had become a spectacle. He wanted to inspect him, and in that inspection, Yasuke's life changed. The audience with Nobunaga is one of the most famous scenes in Yasuke's life, and also one of the most uncomfortable. According to the accounts that survive, Nobunaga initially did not believe Yasuke's skin color was real. He ordered him to be washed or scrubbed, as if the color might be ink or pigment. Only when it did not come away did Nobunaga accept that the man before him was naturally dark-skinned. It is tempting to soften this moment because of what came later. Nobunaga welcomed Yasuke. He rewarded him. He appears to have taken a strong interest in him. But the first gesture matters. Before Yasuke was favored, he was treated as a source of astonishment. Before he was drawn toward power, even his skin had to be verified in front of the ruler. That does not make the later favor meaningless. It makes it more complicated. The Japanese chronicle associated with Ota describes Yasuke as a young man of striking build and strength. Different translations render the description differently, but the broad impression is clear. He was tall, strong, and visually unforgettable to the people recording him. One source reports that Nobunaga praised his strength as if it were the strength of many ordinary men. Another later observation, by Matsudaira Ietada, gives his height as 6 shaku and 2 sun, often converted to roughly 188 centimeters, far taller than most men around him. But again, caution is necessary. The sources are few. Some details come through Jesuit letters, some through Japanese chronicles, some through manuscript variants and later transmission. The more exact a modern retelling becomes, the more suspicious we should be. We do not know Yasuke's private thoughts. We do not know what language he spoke with Nobunaga, or how fluently. We do not know whether he experienced this sudden favor as opportunity, danger, humiliation, survival, or all of them at once. What we do know is that Nobunaga retained him in his circle. That decision fits Nobunaga's world. He was a warlord who understood display. Azuchi Castle itself was a statement in stone, lacquer, gold, height, and spectacle. Nobunaga used audiences and processions as theater. He took interest in foreign goods and foreign people, not because he was simply modern or open-minded in the way we might want him to be, but because the unfamiliar could be made to serve power. Yasuke's presence near him could signal that Nobunaga's reach extended beyond the ordinary Japanese world. It could suggest that this lord attracted people and objects from the ends of the sea. It could make power look wider than geography. And yet, if Yasuke was only a spectacle, the story would end there. The fragments suggest that Nobunaga did more than display him. He brought him close. He gave him a Japanese name, or at least the sources remember him by one: Yasuke. He appears in connection with Nobunaga's household and movements. Later tradition and some manuscript evidence suggest he received a residence, a sword, and support. Those details are exactly where modern arguments begin. Was Yasuke a samurai? Was he a retainer? Was he a bodyguard? Was he a servant armed for display? The record does not give a clean modern label. The better question is not what word we want to win with. The better question is what Nobunaga actually did. The debate over Yasuke often narrows to one word: samurai. Was he one? Was he not? The argument is loud because the word has become larger than the 16th century itself. In modern English, samurai sounds like a fixed identity, almost a costume and a code. In the age of Nobunaga, status was real, hierarchy was real, and warrior service was real. But the boundaries were not always the clean boxes that later memory makes them. So instead of beginning with the word, begin with the evidence. Yasuke was kept near Nobunaga after their first meeting. He was not simply dismissed after the crowd quieted down. He appears to have entered the orbit of the Oda household. Some accounts indicate that Nobunaga gave him money. Manuscript traditions associated with Nobunaga's chronicle have been read to say that Yasuke received a place to live, a sword, and support. Other details, such as the precise nature of his stipend or rank, are harder to state without moving from evidence into interpretation. A sword matters, but it does not solve everything. Servants could carry weapons. Warriors could serve in many forms. A residence and support matter, but they also require careful reading. Was he being treated as a formal warrior retainer, an honored page, a foreign bodyguard, a household servant elevated by favor, or some combination that does not fit our modern categories? Serious historians have disagreed in emphasis, and the surviving sources are too thin to force every question closed. The safest formulation is not the weakest one. It is the most useful one. Yasuke received unusual favor from Nobunaga, was drawn into armed proximity to power, and was remembered by observers as more than a passing visitor. Whether a modern viewer chooses to call that samurai status depends on how strictly the word is being defined. The episode does not need to force the word beyond the evidence. The evidence is already strange enough. What can be said safely is still remarkable. Within about a year of being brought before Nobunaga, Yasuke was not merely a missionary's attendant in the background. He was close enough to Nobunaga to be noticed by Japanese observers. He was associated with the Lord's movements. He was present in the crisis at Honno-ji. And after Nobunaga's death, he appears to have continued to the side of Nobunaga's heir, rather than simply returning to the Jesuits at once. That is not nothing. It places him inside the last year of one of the most consequential lives in Japanese history. In 1582, Nobunaga's power was reaching its height. His armies had broken the Takeda, one of the great military houses of eastern Japan. His commanders were pressing fronts in several directions. The man later known as Toyotomi Hideyoshi was fighting in the west against the Mori. Tokugawa Ieyasu, not yet the founder of the later shogunate, was still a partner and survivor in Nobunaga's shadow. The old order was being crushed and rearranged with astonishing speed. Yasuke moved through this world in the last months before it cracked. One diary entry by Matsudaira Ietada records seeing him in 1582 and describes his height and dark skin. The entry is brief, almost clinical, but its very existence matters. It shows that Yasuke was visible beyond Jesuit circles. Japanese warriors and officials saw him in Nobunaga's world and thought the sight worth recording. This is where Assassin's Creed Shadows enters the modern imagination. The game turns Yasuke into a protagonist, a man whose inner life can be played, whose choices can be made visible. That is fiction. It may be powerful fiction, but it is fiction. The historical Yasuke does not come to us with a questline. He comes as a set of sightings, a crowd, an audience, a description, a name beside power, a presence in catastrophe. And the catastrophe was coming faster than anyone around Nobunaga understood. To understand why Yasuke's last confirmed day matters, you have to understand what Honno-ji was about to destroy. Oda Nobunaga was not merely another daimyo in a century of war. He was the man who had changed the scale of ambition. He had used firearms decisively. He had humbled Buddhist military powers. He had entered Kyoto, influenced the shogunate, and then helped end it as a meaningful rival authority. He built Azuchi Castle, not only as a residence, but as a message. The old world of scattered strongholds was being replaced by something centralized, theatrical, and terrifyingly efficient. By the spring of 1582, Nobunaga looked closer than ever to supremacy. His son Nobutada had led forces against Takeda Katsuyori, and the Takeda house collapsed. Nobunaga's commanders were active across the country. The West remained unfinished, but the momentum seemed to belong to him. The question was not whether he was powerful, the question was whether anyone could still stop him. The answer came from inside his own command. Akechi Mitsuhide was not an outside enemy. He was a trusted vassal, a cultured commander, a man who had served Nobunaga in important campaigns. His motive for rebellion remains one of the great unresolved questions of Japanese history. Later stories give many reasons: personal insult, fear, ambition, court politics, a hidden alliance, a calculation that Nobunaga had become too dangerous. Some theories are plausible, some are late inventions. None has become a final answer. That uncertainty is important. The Honno-ji incident is famous enough that people often retell it as if the psychology were settled. It is not. What is clear is the movement of events. Nobunaga was in Kyoto with a small personal following, preparing to support operations in the West. His main armies were elsewhere. His position in the capital looked secure, because the danger was not expected to come from one of his own men. Mitsuhide was supposed to be moving to support the Western campaign. Instead, his forces turned toward Kyoto. Even here, the details require care. Popular images often place Mitsuhide personally at the front of the attack, shouting famous lines and leading the assault. Some later evidence and modern scholarship complicate that picture, suggesting that subordinates may have led the direct attack, while Mitsuhide ordered the rebellion. For this story, the distinction matters less than the result. The forces acting for Mitsuhide surrounded Nobunaga at Honno-ji. Imagine the vulnerability of that moment. The man who had made himself the center of Japan was sleeping in a temple, away from his armies, guarded by only a small number of men. The system of fear and loyalty he had built around himself held until one trusted part of it turned inward. Yasuke was inside that system, not as the author of it, not as one of the great decision-makers, but close enough that when the center collapsed, he was there to be caught in the fall. That is what makes his story more than a question about a title. If Yasuke had left Japan before 1582, he would be a striking footnote in the history of Jesuit travel and Nobunaga's curiosity. Because he remained, he became a witness to the night when the future of Japan changed. The attack came before morning. The accounts agree on the basic shape. Nobunaga was at Honno-ji with a small party. Akechi Mitsuhide's forces closed in with overwhelming numbers. The temple was attacked. Nobunaga's men fought, but they were not facing a raid they could ride out. They were surrounded inside the capital by troops who knew exactly whom they had come to kill. Some of the most famous details are difficult to handle. Nobunaga's final words, the precise way the fire spread, the exact movements of every guard, the emotional texture of his last moments. These belong partly to history and partly to later storytelling. The safe line is this: Nobunaga was wounded or trapped, withdrew from capture, and died by suicide as Honno-ji burned. His body was not recovered in a way that allowed his enemies to display him. For a warlord, that mattered. A body was proof. A severed head was political evidence. The absence of Nobunaga's body turned the fire itself into a curtain. Mitsuhide had killed the man, but the flames denied him the clean symbol of victory. And Yasuke? The sources do not give us a cinematic duel. They do not place him cutting through rows of attackers in the way a game might. They tell us less, and because they tell us less, we have to resist the temptation to fill every gap. What they do suggest is that Yasuke survived the first collapse, and was then connected to the position of Oda Nobunaga, Nobunaga's eldest son. Nobutada was nearby at the Nijo residence. Once news of the attack spread, he too became a target. If Nobunaga was dead, Nobutada was the immediate Oda heir, the man around whom loyalists might rally. For Mitsuhide's rebellion to succeed, the son had to fall with the father. This is the most revealing movement in Yasuke's story. After the first fire, the record does not show him disappearing from the Oda disaster. It places him around the second doomed center of the clan. Whether from loyalty, duty, confusion, command, or lack of any safer place to go, he remained inside the collapse long enough to be captured when that center fell too. Nobutada's position did not hold. The attackers pressed him. He died by suicide as well. With father and son both dead, the top of the Oda house had been cut away in a single morning. Yasuke was captured alive. Pause there. The men around him, if they were Japanese warriors of the defeated side, faced a world with established expectations about honor, capture, suicide, and execution. Yasuke had been close enough to power to be taken in the same storm. But when the decision came, he was treated differently. That difference may have saved his life. It also suggests a boundary he may never have fully crossed. Yasuke's survival is sometimes told as a clean act of mercy. It was not clean. The Jesuit account says that after Yasuke was captured, Akechi's side decided not to kill him and sent him back to the church. The language attached to that decision is harsh. In the hostile phrasing of the source, Yasuke was treated as someone foreign, ignorant, not Japanese, outside the warrior community, whose deaths had just filled the mourning. We do not need to repeat the insult to understand it. The meaning is clear enough. Yasuke may have stood near Nobunaga. He may have carried weapons. He may have received favor, support, and a place in the household. But in the eyes of the men who captured him, he was still not one of them in the way that mattered at the moment of defeat. That is the central tragedy of his survival. If he had been fully recognized as a Japanese warrior enemy, he might have been killed. If he had been considered only a harmless servant, perhaps he would not have been at Nijo at all. Instead, he occupied a dangerous middle space, close enough to power to be present when it burned, perhaps not close enough in the eyes of his captors to receive the same treatment as the men dying around him. The decision also complicates the modern argument over whether he was a samurai. The evidence of Nobunaga's favor points one way. The language of Akechi's men points another. Both can be true in different registers. Nobunaga may have elevated Yasuke into some form of armed or household service. Other Japanese warriors may still have refused to see him as fully belonging to their order. Status in practice is not only what one patron gives, it is also what others recognize when that patron is dead. At Honno-ji, Nobunaga was dead. That left Yasuke exposed to the judgment of men who had no reason to honor Nobunaga's preferences. They did not treat him as a lord. They did not treat him as a political hostage worth keeping. They returned him to the Jesuits, as if returning him to the foreign religious world from which he had entered Nobunaga's orbit. The missionaries reportedly gave thanks that he had survived. Their relief is understandable. They had seen the mourning consume Nobunaga and Nobutada. They had every reason to know that Yasuke could have been killed with them. But after that relief, the record closes. This is where responsible history has to stop saying more than it knows. We do not know whether Yasuke remained with the Jesuits. We do not know whether he left Japan. We do not know whether he entered another lord's service, returned to Portuguese Asia, died young, lived old, married, fought again, or told anyone what he had seen. Every version of his later life is speculation unless new evidence appears. And yet, that silence is not empty. It tells us something about the kind of person history preserves and the kind it loses. Nobunaga's death reshaped Japan. Mitsuhide's betrayal became legend. Hideyoshi's revenge came quickly, and he would step into the opening Nobunaga left behind. The great names continued moving across the page. Yasuke did not. The man who had been impossible for Kyoto not to see became almost overnight impossible for history to follow. Assassin's Creed Shadows begins from the fact that history left a door open. The game can send Yasuke through that door. It can give him missions, alliances, enemies, and a future beyond Honno-ji. That is what fiction does when the archive falls silent. It turns a blank space into movement. There is nothing wrong with that, as long as we remember where the blank space begins. The real Yasuke is not a complete biography. He is a sequence of fragments, an African man in the Portuguese and Jesuit world of the Indian Ocean, a bodyguard or attendant attached to Alessandro Valignano, a sensation in Sakai and Kyoto, a man scrubbed before Nobunaga because the ruler did not believe what he was seeing, a favored presence in the orbit of the most powerful warlord in Japan, a figure whose exact status is debated because the evidence is suggestive but thin, a man present when Nobunaga's world collapsed, a captive spared for reasons that reveal both survival and exclusion, and then nothing. No source lets us hear his own voice. No source tells us what he thought of Nobunaga, of Japan, of the Jesuits, of the crowds, of the sword, of the fire. The people who wrote about him were observers, missionaries, warriors, chroniclers, men with their own languages and assumptions. They noticed what astonished them. They preserved what mattered to their worlds. Yasuke himself is there only in the reflections they left behind. That is why the question of whether he was a samurai, though important, cannot carry the whole story. If we make that word the entire battlefield, we risk missing the stranger and sadder shape of his life. He crossed oceans. He entered a country at war. He became visible to one of the most powerful men alive. He stood close enough to history that when the center burned, the smoke touched him too. Then the record let him go. Maybe he lived many years after 1582. Maybe he died soon after. Maybe he returned to a world where the name Yasuke meant nothing. Maybe he remained in Japan under another name no one connected to the man at Honno-ji. The honest answer is that we do not know. That honesty does not weaken the story. It is the story. History is not only made of what survives, it is also made of people who appear for a moment in someone else's record. Bright enough to stop a city, close enough to a lord to stand inside the fire. Then they disappear before anyone thought to ask who they were when no one was watching. The game gives Yasuke a path after Honno-ji. Modern arguments give him labels to fight over. The archive gives him neither. It gives him a few scenes, and then it asks us to live with uncertainty. The sources give him a different ending. Not death, not victory, not revenge. A release, a return to the missionaries, and silence. So the most haunting thing about Yasuke is not that history confirms every legend about him. It does not. The most haunting thing is that the record shows just enough to reveal that there was once a life here, moving through oceans, crowds, castles, and fire, and then refuses to tell us where that life went. A man survived the morning that killed Nobunaga. Then history dropped him after dawn.